Alaris's eyes had glazed the scene before her, an impossibility to her mind. Her Kosephen, the gentle Titan to whom a will to fight is but nature, the one she wanted, and he who gave himself to her willingly, laid unmoving, his form a lifeless one, his eyes now soulless, his mind gone. Alaris watched as the human No yelled, her position close, yet her voice distant. Demands from her go past Alaris, yet this No, this Angela kept yelling, and her demands fell on deaf ears. Alaris observes as Angela starts beating his form, hands like hammers, every swing hard, power like a demon, a savage glint in her eye, a declaration of hate, hate at fate, and the goddess, and at death's hands. Every break she yells words foreign to Alaris, but known by someone behind her. Alaris turns her gaze. There are 4 officers. They are panicked. The sight of the human No, a terror to their passive minds, they have frozen, eyes glazing over at the display of force, power, and savagery. Her mind demands they do something to try as his packmate does. Alaris roars, "Save him!" Her posture shifts, claws freed completely, her mouth agape with a snarl, a clear display of options save her Kosephen or die. Their minds snap and they move. Fear of death overtakes their fear of his packmate. Alaris looks over to Angela, now atop him, hands still hammering him, an attempt to force air through him, her eyes desperate for him to live. Angela's effort is still fruitless, but Alaris can't help, a truth she knows. She had held him but moments ago, his eyes making promises, his tender touch, and love for her, all gone. Alaris watches as the medical staff returns with 2 carts full of equipment, items Angela readily uses and directs them on, as different liquids are fed into his body, ice melting on cracked skin, ambered form a shade deeper. Alaris gazes as they ready him, a reviver unit charging. His muscles contract as it is used, but he remains as he is, eyes still blank. Her curse bore true. Alaris pains at their efforts for him, the reviver unit charged. His form shudders at its shock, and she can never hold him again. Another mate to fall, and her heart aches. Alaris dismays as they kept trying. The reviver unit powers up once more, but this time she has no wish to wait, hoping without action, and her voice comes again, a painful, agonized howl, desperate to hold him. Alaris screams, "Do not leave me!" Her kin's banshee howl, a natural weapon of her world, her kin's only gift, her tone loud and long, glass shatters and walls quake. A powerful voice as to reach him, to rage at the passage he walks, as his shape convulses once more. Yet this time, a breath is drawn, eyes widen for a moment, and his visage fell on her before it falls to slumber. Alaris watched his chest rise and fall, his skin shifting over muscles as he breathes, a will to see her drawing him, pulling him back to her, the realms of the afterlands bested by her Kosephen, her Titan at her heart. Her body gives way and her knees find the floor. Her heart is an unyielding maelstrom of emotions. She is thankful. The goddess gave her the force needed, the angel in the form of Angela giving him a chance, and the monstrous might he owns pulling him back, all so that she may hold him once more, and she can't help but cry. David's mind tries to recall what had happened, but he can't remember much, most of it hazy. He remembers hearing Alaris. She screamed something, and he can recall an operation, and he thinks he saw his kid. Then it comes back to him, the pain, a searing, agonizing pain, like a trillion sunburns throughout and within his body. Then darkness. His eyes are sore, and he is parched. His body is craving water, and he can feel dryness in his throat, the weight of his body pressing down, a stiffness throughout. But his eyes open nevertheless. His gaze shifts down to a soft silver mane of hair over his hand, the one which is held. The mane shifts every few seconds. The sounds of sobbing call to him, a demand to comfort, so he brings his other hand up and over. Alaris. His hand gently rests on her head, slowly stroking her. I am fine and alive. Her head slowly rises to face him, eyes red from weeping. So please stop crying, he says, his voice as calming and soothing as possible, his gaze as reassuring as he can muster. Her eyes show a deep concern, its foundation solid, as though some illusion had shattered or fear taking hold. Her hands tighten on his, claws prodding into his skin. Her tail is swinging slowly like she is unsure of his safety. Please, my Zanno. His hand cupped her face, a tender pull. to draw her close. "I'm not going anywhere." His eyes played 100 songs of certainty, love, and reassurance. "Your cry brought no CS no to heal, and she knows not to take me." He gently kisses her forehead. "So please, do not fear. I have nowhere to go but to you." She looks up, her visage shifting at his word, no complete change, but an acceptance of his fate, at least evident for now. "You died!" Her eyes backpedal to fear and anxiety, tears run down her cheeks, her hand closes harder. "I lost you!" Her voice carried on sore vocal cords, a desperation in her tone. "Please don't get hurt any time soon. I don't think I can handle that." "I shall do my best," he says, wiping tears away with his hand, his cracked lips giving as warm of a smile he can manage. "I can't promise that danger wouldn't find me, but I am only human." His eyes pushing a will to succeed, underlined with his love. "Besides, I have to stay by your side. I am your Kisifane." Her demeanor gives, joy takes to the foreground, her care of him pushing away doubt, and she presses her lips to his, her eyes shut as she does, hands clasping around his head, her power pushing his frail form, their kiss short but powerful. As they break for air, she studies his face, fingertips feeling the dryness, but fear and love battle in her gaze. "I'll get Angela and water," she says as she pulls away. He watches her leave, a hesitance still lingering in her mind, but her energy to care for him is limitless, however. As she exits the room, a thought crosses his mind. She seemed so sure I would be okay. Maybe my dying did a number on her. He would have to make a concerted effort to reassure her of his health and safety. David took the chance to look at himself, though his movement was restrained at the pain of such actions. His skin was drier than his time on Arrakis 3, and his color was a bit deeper, less amber, now more like a brown ale, and he could see a few of the points where the wires had pushed into his body. The door opened to Alaris and Angela walking in. Alaris had 4 water bottles with her, all but one carried in her arm, while she handed him the 4th, a caring yet fearful visage as she did. Angela was out of her uniform, now dressed in simple workout clothes, her blonde hair down, and signs of worry on her face while she readied a bioscanner and her tablet. "Angela," David said as he accepted the bottle, "please tell me it worked." He twisted the top off and drank slowly, fearful of shocking his system. "Yes, we got them all," she said as she finished her scan. "Also, Hans wants to talk to you. The results of the treatment had some unforeseen side effects, but he understands them better. That aside, the head of medical has signed your paperwork and you are free to leave in the morning." Her eyes gave off a want to say more, but she shifted her attention to Alaris. "David, there is one more thing," Alaris said as she held a mirror for him, her hands shaking as she did. "Your eyes have changed, permanently." David took the mirror and slowly looked. The emerald eyes he once had were gone. Having been replaced by a silvered wash hiding even his irises from view, they seemed to give no inference to what he was looking at, or his emotions. A sight he couldn't help but snort at. "Fucking hell, I look like a discount Riddick," he said as he put the mirror down for a second, before looking again. "What is a Riddick?" Alaris asked, her tone one of confusion, while her posture stiffened and her ears pulled back in fear. "It's a fictional character from a movie series. We used to watch them back during our training for this assignment," Angela explained. Her amusement at the situation was noticeable. "Don't worry," he put the mirror away. "It just means some humans may find me intimidating, and everyone else will lose their shit every time I talk." He took a second bottle and opened it. "But I can see this as an issue. No one can read my eyes. I have to speak with a better tone and facial expressions if I want to convey my feelings." His face turned to Alaris, an understanding forming. "I'll do my best to keep you in the know when it comes to my heart," David said before taking a drink. "Well, David, I want you to take it easy for a day or two. Don't go too hard on the training and no fights," Angela said before turning to leave. "Also eat a lot. Your body needs it. Rest and recover. That's the doctor's order." Her tone was that of happiness at his recovery. David watched her for a second before something came back to him. "Wait, Angela!" David called. He willed his voice to sound calm and happy, to not annoy her. "I want to thank you. You did save my life, but you also—" He shifted a bit, the reason a bit uncomfortable. "You helped us come together, so thanks." He took Alaris's hand and held it tight, but hers was still stiff. David, Alaris came and asked about humans. A lot of questions about our kind's relationships, but ones I knew most of the answers to, she said, as she turned, her face twisting a few times, shifting as she ordered her thoughts. I am happy for both of you. I have been concerned by your mental health for a while, and she has a good effect on you. Her visage gave way to a contentful smile. Just don't start trying for a kid, for at least a week, maybe 2. The crew already thinks we are monsters, no need to add to the mill. Her hands waving off as she left. David sat in his bed. The odd turn of events left him a bit stunned. He had survived, and he did so only because he heard Alaris. Her scream did reach him, and he was sure of it. He slowly pulled at her hand, his face shifted, as his wish to hold her, truly hold her, came. She gave it, as she moved the bottles, and sat in his lap. I also want to thank you. He took her hands, holding them tight, a desire to keep her growing. I heard you, a powerful call, but they were pained, the bit of me that was holding on. His eyes gave way to tears, and his breath grew hard. It raged to see you again. Your voice called to me, and I came, so thank you for bringing me back. He centered his gaze on her, allowing his love of her reach his lips, a joyful grin forming. She smiled back, then it faded. A frightened face took her. You look a bit scary, pupilless eyes and all. Her hand, still in his, shook as she spoke. Your eyes, they are alike to beast from my home world. It's hard for me to look. Some instinctual need taking a hold. Her eyes averted from him, her voice growing fearful. It is haunting, and I am afraid to see it. Her body pulls away, but he holds her. I am sorry. David looked away. His hands felt her grip loosen, but he held tighter. Is it that scary that you forget who I am? His voice carrying a fear of their future and a doubt of her love. Am I not your Cussifane any longer? He asked with a pained and angry heart. He could feel her hands freeze at his words, her body stiff and her tail sink. Should he have said that? Did he need to attack her, punishing their time together? But one of her hands rips away and grabs him by the chin, forcefully centering his eyes on hers. Noticeable anger on her visage, her eyes narrowed, her lips parted to a snarl, and her ears pinned back. Don't you dare say that! Her dislike of his eyes now fully replaced by her anger. I care for you and you alone. I watched you die, and still I remain. Her claws poking out at him, slowly digging at his skin. I would sooner die than lose you, but your eyes remind me of a Hayakish, and I will live with that. Her voice pained and fearful, a force that he can't ignore. So don't you dare say that I don't care for you, stupid human. He can feel it, her mind fighting her. She does want him, but his eyes are that of a beast, some nightmare of her kin. You are right, he says while closing his eyes to her and lowering his head. There was no reason to hurt you, and I get what you mean. Your eyes used to scare me. His hand pulled hers in. But mine are not like yours. You can still give emotions. Mine can't. He inhales deep, a need to silence his heart. I am a stupid human, from some foreign world, whose culture is completely different to yours. So, his free hand slowly raises, a gesture he had made at their first meeting, one she knew and one he understood. Forgive your foolish human Cussifane. Findra, she mutters and takes his hand. I will forgive you this once. She lifts his hand, but you will have to make it up to me. Holding it in place, 3 days after Kiga's Kila Hinner, her hand returning his to his lap. You are mine for the night, before she pulls him into a kiss, one he returns. David was now free of the medical center, and his walk was interesting. Most of the crew now froze when they saw him. Perhaps his eyes truly seemed like those of beasts. He had spent last night avoiding eye contact with Alaris, and while he had to, it also pained him, the inability to see her face. As he finally reached the lab of Hans, the door was open with the sound of voices, an argument between a few against many, but he didn't care that much to eavesdrop, so he just walked in. There were about 4 people on one side of the lab, while 10 others stood on the other side. David looked around, making an effort to turn his head, though none noticed him. Hans, Noila, Kiga, and Zithfo stood by the refrigeration unit, while opposite them stood a pack of Kyle mares, nutty space squirrels. Well, you can't call them that out loud. Turns out every planet had some form of a squirrel. The environmental requirements changed their appearance and physiology slightly, but most were the same. Except the Kaomares. Those nutters evolved on a cradle world, one with only 2 predators, which they exterminated when they figured out how to throw things. Now they are bipedal, furry zealots that don't like anything that deviates from their god's plans. A notion David never understood. They don't do research, well, not fast, and their culture boils down to 3 core ideas. 1, don't kill unless you must. 2, don't harm unless it saves a life. And 3, if it eats meat, then it needs to die, which makes him ask how they even left their homeworld, as they really should have overpopulated to extinction. But never mind all that. The real question David needed is, where is their liaison officer, because this can get violent and fast, considering their general demeanor to any offense to their religion. David closed his eyes and loudly coughed, before taking a military stance, one befitting an officer of rank. His shoulders rolled back, hands clasped below the swell of his back, feet shoulder-width apart. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice loud. "Yes, there is. Your scholar has done the unthinkable. He has tampered with the works of the Holy Mother," came a voice from the Kaomare's lines. It oozed with holier-than-thou energy. "We demand that he hands over all research and samples. They need to be destroyed before we return to her domain." Hans's voice called out next, anger bubbling in his words. "You tried to break in and torch my lab. There's no way I am giving you anything." David exhaled. "Kaomares, where is your liaison officer?" His voice carried with stern displeasure at what he heard, his head staying still. The zealot leader stated, "He is But David snapped his eyes open. "If he is unavailable, then you are in breach of rules and regulations." David didn't move. "I trust you know the consequences of such breaches if you don't please ask." He could see the Kaomare freeze, their fear of his eyes, and choice of word breaking them down. "Now, unless you want me to contact security, I recommend you leave." His body shifted, and he turned his whole form at them. His head came a bit down. The pack of zealots seemed to seize up as he turned, and they finally broke and ran when one of them, with a weaker mental fortitude, fainted. As soon as their footfalls wore gone, David turned to Hans and company. Hans studied him with the same interest he shows in all things he does, well, from a scientific standpoint. Noila stood perfectly still, her face showing no emotion, but her scales gave way to the fear she felt looking at him as they expanded up and away from her. Kiga froze too, but her ears pointed his way, and her eyes watched every small movement he made. Zithphos, however, seemed to choose the fainting option as he crumpled when David turned around. This whole eyes thing was getting annoying to David. It's one thing for the Lithrani and Keolmire to be scared, but Alaris and Kiga, too. It's probably the fact they can't tell where he is looking, but even then, people he had spoken to a week ago now can't string 3 words together. "Hans, I came because I was informed you have something interesting to tell me," David said, as he slowly closed his eyes and heard the sounds of relaxing scales and breaths escaping from frozen forms. "Yes, but first, I would prefer you don't stand in my lab blind," Hans said, as his voice shifted its position around with the sounds of movement before a hand gives David something. "Here they aren't much, but they should help." David felt what was in his hand, a mental image of glasses taking shape, and his mind knew what to do, and slid them on. "They were my father's," Hans continued, his face slowly showing as David opened his eyes. The world was a shade darker, but he could see. "They are multi-layered ballistic visors with a black filter over the top that has a noticeable point of focus." Haz's voice carried a note of pride, his hands gesturing for David to turn. David shifted his gaze, looking over his shoulder, and he saw Kiga and Noila, but they didn't freeze. They looked at him for a second, a mixture of curiosity and joy. David couldn't help but smile at them. "Now, on to the matter at hand," Hans said as he pulled David to a stool. "David, you are relatively well learned. I have seen your public record. Do you know what catalyst theory is?" Sort of," David said sheepishly as he sat down. He had read a bit of an article, but it wasn't too interesting to him. "Kiga, can you refresh him on it?" Hans said as he walked away to get something. "Sure," Kiga said, wandering into David's line of sight. So catalyst theory is the current understanding that the galactic academic world has accepted when it comes to humans and the two subgroups that now exist. It postulates that the human form is malleable by its conditions, so it can overcome obstacles it encounters. As of right now, there are two known types. Earthborn, who are much like Hans and Cole. Their bodies are denser and stronger than most other races. Earth gifting that to them, they are also considered the norm for humans. Her hands moved a bit as she spoke, eyes moving like she was reading off the air in front of her. The other type is Edenborn. They normally aren't as heavy and have a lower muscle mass, but that they have a greater amount of vision, being able to peer into the infrared and ultraviolet spectrums. The interesting part is that it lays the groundwork for forced evolution, the human form giving way and changing to survive. It holds to the theory that with a sufficiently powerful catalyst, coupled with a will to endure, any human could change their biology to survive regardless of the outcome. However, the threshold for the change is unknown, as testing on living beings is outlawed. Yes, which is why you are interesting, Hans said as he came back with a tablet and bioscanner. Your body appears to have undergone this change now twice. The first is from your encounter with the parasites, and the second is from the procedure you technically died in, both shifting your body in an effort to survive. Hans's eyes lighting up as he tapped at his tablet. Your overall code is still human, but you have gained some noticeable changes from your former Earthborn form. He looked at David. Let's start with your eyes, his visage one of absolute fascination. The silver wash they have is an additional layer just under your cornea that seems to be automatically countering light, acting like sunglasses, but ones that can let you look at the sun without breaking away. Hans checked his tablet again, then walked a bit away. Also, the procedure has changed your skin. A membrane had been added to your skin cells that act like a natural radiation barrier, bouncing away unwanted solar radiation, which means you can't get skin cancer, but you can't tan. Hans shifted a bit as he put down the tablet and rubbed his eyes before turning to face David again. As for what the encounter with the parasites has done, it has changed your reproductive code and immune system in an odd effort to starve the parasites and ensure that the ability is passed down. Hans clasped his hands on David's shoulder, a look of wrathful anger at David's fortune singing loud. You can now be a father to a child born from a Zondraphane mother. Lastly, your veins and blood have grown a bit in size, most likely an effort to allow for air and nutrients to reach your whole body faster. You will find it easier to maintain activity for greater periods, and you will need to breathe less hard when you do start to tire, likely a result of your body losing its battle with the parasites. Hans slapped David's shoulders before standing up again. So, now you have to ask yourself a question. I am a bit angry that you get to answer this. Hans folded his arms over his chest and exhaled. What will you call this type of human? David watched Hans, then Kiga, and finally Noila. All of them seemed to be kind of curious about what he will think of. Hans was the angry kind you get when someone believes they have a good answer. Kiga was the raptured kind, that akin to a child watching a movie unfold. And Noila was the uncomfortable kind, like when naming a monster of nightmares. Then a thought crossed David's mind. One Kiga will hate, but one he wanted to own. You can call it Hyakish, David said, and saw Kiga's ears snap back as she inadvertently stepped away. Why that? Hans asked, seemingly aware of what it was. I want that word to have two meanings. One is the beast from Zandra, and the other to mean me. David answered, his voice stern and concise. One is a deadly hunter and predator from the Twilight world, the other a deadly hunter and predator that hunts it. Findra, David, Kiga said, as Hans shook his head, and Noila looked confused. Noila, a Hyakish, is a hunter from Zandra that hunts by confusing its victims with a natural sound weapon before ripping them apart with its claws. It is about twice the size of a Clokash and can glide a short distance with the membranes under its arms and legs. Hans said, as he noted her confusion, Do you remember bats? Well, like that, but way bigger and meaner? She stiffened as the image formed in her mind, and her eyes shifted to David, a terror taking to her face. Why is every human I meet crazier than the last? David felt his muscles strain. His workout was slow and careful, but he had to do it. His time as a patient had taken a good bit of his strength away. The gym was packed with Zandrophanes and humans, but a nice bubble had formed around him, broken by his team. A lot of eyes were watching him and studying him. Zandrophane males curious at his slow and deliberate moves. Zandrodane females taking a chance to figure out their odds of beating him. And the last was Angela. She is keeping him under watch, ensuring that he doesn't overdo it, a fear she rightly has. "Last one and you're done," Angela said, as he brought the barbell up once more, lifting it with his legs and his arms keeping it steady on his shoulders, before lowering it back down and placing it on the stand it rests on. The weight itself was about a third less than before his attack. He had a long way to go if he wants to get back his strength. "Well done. Now go and hit the treadmill. You have a 20-minute run, then go eat and sleep." "Yep," David said as he walked over to the cardio equipment, his eyes shifting under his visor. Each Zandrodane he could see was tense, as though ready to fight him. A credible threat, but they all know they don't want to yet. They want to know how he fights, so they are waiting and judging him. Based on the looks he is getting, they aren't impressed, if they ever were. He and his team never pushed their limits, only trying to keep what they had, not gaining more. An effort to stay under the radar and avoid rumors, one he will have to break in a day or two. As David stepped up to the treadmill, he realized he would need to take off the visor. It wouldn't stay on anyway. "Well, this will scare them at least," he says to no one. His eyes closed as he takes off the thing that keeps everyone from panicking, placing it in a bottle holder, his hands resting on the controls, and then slowly he opens them to the world. About 50 sets of ears pin back with fear, while the rest lock towards him. Every Zandrophane's gaze is affixed on him. About 76 sets of eyes intently watching his next move. His team has noticed a freeze in movement, and they look too, cheeky grins forming as jokes are pulled into their minds, ones he will not hear the end of. David had to make a conscious effort to move his face as he input the settings for his run and started. His team does eventually go back to their workouts, but everyone else is still affixed to him, and the tension is starting to bother him. "If you are done, then leave," David partly yells. "I do not need your fear, so go," before the speed picks up. To his delight, more than half rush to finish their workouts and leave, while the rest watch him out the corners of their eyes, one ear always turned his way as they keep at their sets. This was a bit more fun than he would admit after all. As David walked out of the gym, his arms stretching to free some tension, he heard footfalls and turned slowly to them. Approaching him was Keen Quiss the Bold, the Kalmare liaison officer. His slightly blue fur swayed as he walked. Behind him was the troop from Hans's lab. Keen Quiss was a head taller than most of his kind, but still stood about 4.5 feet tall. His ears scanned the surroundings before locking on him. His stride was poised and full of self-righteousness. His eyes watching David, scrutinizing him. David had a long conversation with him a day ago, and he was a prickly one, questions over questions, always looking for a fault. "David Solomon," he said as he got within 2 arms' length of David, "I have been informed that you are possessed, so I ask but once." He rose to his full height and puffed out his chest. "Show me your eyes so that I may see if a malevolent being has taken hold." "I cannot allow this request," David said back, his shoulder rolling back a bit. "Not because of a lack of your faith, but a belief in my goddess and her gifts. One's not of your god's realms," his voice conveying his will to not surrender. "So not of your concern." Now, David," Keen Quiss said as he maintained his stance. "You and I know you have no faith in the human goddess," his eyes still watching David. "Why would you blaspheme lest you have something to hide?" David could feel a slow rage growing. These space rodents are annoying. "You dare question her will!" David said, his voice now harsh and summoning a demand for attention. "But a night ago, she placed an ordeal before me. She who by her hands work saw to me being baptized in her divine light. She who carried me into her realm and marked my form and eyes by her hand and returned me to my works on this land. You dare challenge her will!" David shifted his stance, taking that of anger. "You dare to challenge her name and spit curses at her before me, before her chosen agent." David let his throat growl and lips pull to a snarl. Think your words carefully, Keen Quiss, for we are not in the domains of either pantheon, and I will not see her word and name, holy and hallowed Gaia, be challenged. Keen Quiss froze, and fear crept into his eyes. I would never curse the gods. But if what you say is true, then I must see for myself. I can see you are changed, but that does not beget the fears of my scurry, so you will show me your eyes. His voice was awash with fear and panic, but he is indeed bold. Fine, but do you know the color my goddess enjoys most? David asked as he relaxed and reached up for his visor, holding it still as he awaited an answer. No, I do not. She likes but two. One is the color she is, a rich green, a life-giver that she is, David said slowly as he took his visor off and looked at Keen Quiss. The other is silver, like that which shines from every star, a light of her wrath to be felt at her anger. Keen Quiss stared at him, fear chemicals raging, as his body demands he runs. She had chosen the color of her fury for you, he stammers, voice cracking at the sight. Yes, David said, his voice stern and wrathful. For my works are hard and unforgiven, her plans of me unbearable as the flame of her anger, she who pushes all her children. But I am her sword, meant but to cut those who stray, those who spit at her and cut at the forms she has made. And if you still are uncertain, then when we arrive at the next unclaimed domain I will show you, for her protection is upon me, and her mark allows me to look at her arsenal, and you will see as I gaze at her weapons without fear. Now excuse me. David turned and briskly walked away, taking a bit of a longer path to the briefing room, one last thing to do before tomorrow. His end of a deal to keep.